Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله الذين أذب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا ورضوان الله تعالى على الصحابات الراشدين والتابعين لهم بخير وإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وبعد. Firstly, before we begin with this class, two things. One is that this is the 13th night of the month of Rabi al-Awwal, the blessed month in which our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born. And on Thursday night or the Jummah night, it is recommended for us to send much abundance and blessings upon him. So I recommend you to do this. And then also the second thing is it's with a heaviness of heart that one of our sisters in the community just passed away not that long ago. Ustad Muhammad Taysir Safi and Ustad Lina Safi's mother just passed away. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive her of her sins, have mercy upon her soul, to grant her the intercession of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and to grant her Jannah Firdausul A'la. Ameen, ameen, ameen. So this is session number 7 on the issue of America. So let us begin with this evening's presentation. And let me get up this PowerPoint situation for us right now. And okay, Bismillah. So the social construction of whiteness is today's lesson. And let's begin with this, that whiteness, as we understand in America today, is not historically what it was at the founding of the original colonies of the United States of America. The issue of what we call white meant something different centuries ago. And it even means something different today in different lands. So when we use this term whiteness, we are using it specifically for the American context. And as whiteness is understood in America, it is in fact a social construction or a social construct, meaning it as something that was built or devised. Thus, it's a construction that could also be deconstructed. So, for instance, and I'll just go back much earlier than the founding of the original 13 colonies, in which the Virginia colony was the first. But if we look back at Islamic history, for instance, in the time of the first generation of Muslims, whiteness meant something different back then in comparison to how we understand today, even as Muslims or even as Arabs. And white, the term white, was basically a benign term. And there was no virtue or extra white rights that were attached to skin color to people, including even amongst the Arabs prior to the revealing of the Quran, by the way. So we know the saying of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, لا فضل العربين على الأعجمي ولا الأعجمين على العربي ولا الأسود على الأحمر ولا الأحمر على الأسود إلا بالتقوى. That there is no superiority of the Arab over the non-Arab, nor of the non-Arab over the Arab. And there's no virtue of the black over literally the red. This is how Arabs use the term to describe white folks, which I'll explain in a moment. There's no virtue of the black over the red, nor the red over the black, except in God consciousness. So how the Arabs understood Ahmar, or the red, was number one, people from the Byzantine Empire, from the Roman Empire, Qawm-ur-Rum, and then also Persians were considered to be of the Ahmar people, and Arabs did not consider themselves to be amongst the whites. They considered themselves in closer civilizational proximity to the blacks, meaning in particular the Abyssinians and the Nubians. Thus, Arabs were quasi-black, and many Arabs themselves were black. So that's a very different understanding for even how Arab Americans operate today, in which I will get to a little later on in the presentation. So again, whiteness within America has changed. And in fact, there was no such thing even as white people as a construct when the British first established the Jamestown colony in the year 1607. Jamestown, being a colony that is established, is currently, that area is currently in what we would call York County, Virginia. That is right outside of Williamsburg, Virginia. And I grew up not that far away from there. My grandfather lives in close proximity to the former location of the origin of the Jamestown colony. So when did white people actually begin in America? And I'm speaking specifically from the British context, because the founders, the so-called founders of this land, which then constituted the 13 colonies. These were colonies under British control. These were British colonies. So just to walk through an historical timeline, as was mentioned, 1607 was the founding of the Jamestown colony, when British people came to America in what we know today to be the first colony, Virginia, and the first state in which the first presidents came from the state of Virginia. The first Africans that came here in servitude were not chattel slavery. The first Africans that came here to the Americas as servants were actually indentured servants. They were not chattel. And this is, I think, very important for us to understand in our historical narrative, that in the origin of the colony of Virginia, there were not chattel slaves at the very beginning. There also were European indentured servants too, and many of these were people who were working off debts. They were people such as the Scottish people, for instance, Irish. These were also people who were brought to the first colony, and they worked the land. So the issue of indentured servitude in the very beginning was not based upon color. Then this began to shift some, in MA on the slide stands for Massachusetts. So we have the Massachusetts colony, and in 1641, and then later on, ironically, the Virginia colony actually established itself firmly before the Massachusetts colony, but it took about 20 years later for a similar policy mirroring the Massachusetts colony that limited some of the rights of African indentured servants in comparison to European indentured servants. So there began to be somewhat of a restriction. Now, we could look at the origin of whiteness or white people in America, then started around this particular time period. We could say after the era of 1661, which leads us to something called 1676. And there's some good books that are written about this. And I think you can even go on YouTube. I believe PBS has done a documentary about this. So there's something that is famous or infamous in American history that is known as Bacon's Rebellion. And a wealthy landowner, actually, who was a Britisher, he was an immigrant to the Virginia colony by the name of Nathaniel Bacon. He launched a revolt against the Virginia governor in 1676. So launching a revolt against the Virginia governor, in effect, was launching a revolt against the British state, because the Virginia governor was appointed to and working on behest of the British government. And this revolt that took place, he had enlisted European indentured servants as well as African indentured servants to fight against the Virginia governor. And if they were successful, they had a promise of freedom. But Nathaniel Bacon's revolt wasn't based upon any sort of um, abolitionist type of sentiments. It was not based on he had some pristine high human ideas that Europeans and Africans were equal, as if he was trying to start some sort of egalitarian social revolution. That's not the case at all. Nathaniel Bacon, being a landowner, he owned certain land or certain properties, or he claimed certain properties that are kind of on the frontiers of the power base of the Virginia governorship, and it was called the House of Burgesses, which was in one particular area further to the east and in central Virginia. So Nathaniel Bacon had a problem with the indigenous people, or the First Nation people, or some call these people natives or Native Americans, that he had problems or issues where he felt that he was unsafe and that Native people were encroaching on the land that he claimed in the expansionism project of the British. The governor of the state of Virginia had a disagreement with Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon wanted a more aggressive policy against the native people or the indigenous tribes in that area. He wanted a more aggressive policy, Mr. Bacon did, than the governor. So because of the governor of Virginia, again, who was a arm of the state of the British government, Nathaniel Bacon revolted against the Virginia governor. Thus, he was revolting against the British, right? So the point of this is that this revolution failed, or this revolt failed, I should say. And after Bacon's rebellion was put down, the governorship and the people who were a part of the House of Burgesses were really concerned about this issue, about this seeming unity of Africans who were indentured servants and slaves, unifying with the poor Europeans, and perhaps they could rise up and actually take over power. So based upon this, they then devised what we could say a divide and conquer scheme in the Virginia House of Burgesses that made the first sweeping legal distinction between white and black. And thus, within this legislation, black people who were black were relegated to less movement and to permanent chattel slave status, whereas people who were considered white, European indentured servants, had more freedom of movement, could pay off their debt and thus be free, or work off their debt for a number of years, wherever their indentured servitude was, for 5 years or for 7 years, and they could be free. And if they were able to save up enough money, they could even buy land, whereas as people who were black were not able to do that. So this was we could say this is basically the invention of white people in America as a tool of separating poor blacks and poor whites from uniting. And it was a similar tool that was used by rich, wealthy landowners, by the way, in the Reconstruction era to after the Civil War, to try to separate poor whites from newly freed descendants of enslaved Africans from uniting and fighting against the land barons, and from, if we want to use modern day terminology, revolting against the 1%. Now, we mentioned this timeline. White wasn't even used as a description in the English language to describe people until around this same time period. So white, to describe people, entered into the Oxford Dictionary and there was no Merriam-Webster dictionary at the time here in the States, the Oxford Dictionary, entered into the official dictionary of English nomenclature in the year 1671, right, where it became officially a part of the dictionary that white was described for people within the English language, right? Um, and this term of white, it wasn't a standard term prior to this, or even at the time of the founding of the British colony. This wasn't a common term that Englishmen would use in literature or they would use in speech to refer to themselves as the white man or white men or white people. This wasn't something that was common. This wasn't something that was part of the idiom or the general conversation of people of the English language. And Europe, for the longest, by the way, even when they came up with this term white, there was no unified European identity for a number of centuries. Even after this, Europeans saw themselves like other people in the world, such as in Africa, where Africans themselves didn't see themselves as one like wide black diaspora. People saw themselves as tribal identities, and Europeans had this tribal affiliations, or maybe we can say quasi-tribal. But the English and the Scottish and the Welsh, these were uh, distinct groups. This even plays itself out to a small point today, even with the issue of Brexit, about how one particular group of people in the United Kingdom, the governmental entity that unified all of these different groups of people, how they didn't want to even be a part of Brexit because they seen themselves historically as being oppressed or marginalized even by the English, right? So similarly, in as mentioned, Africa, there was no such thing as some universal black identity in West Africa. People were Fula from the Fulani tribe or the Hausa tribe, the Yoruba tribe, Mende, Mendinka, Bambara, etc. Right, and the whole issue of people on the continent seeing themselves as black or even African, because people who live on the continent didn't even name the continent Africa or name themselves African. This is just a response. Pan-Africanism and black consciousness is really just more so a response to the social construction of whiteness and how it was used to subjugate people who were defined as not being white. And then, of course, we have other developments that came after 1671 and Bacon's Rebellion being put down with pseudosciences such as eugenics and before such aspects of pseudo-cultural anthropology that tried to divide people up into different groups such as Caucasoid on top and Mongoloid and Negroid, with the Caucasoid being assigned innately or intrinsically superior intelligence and character traits, and then Mongoloid having some, and then down at the bottom, Negroid. And this pseudoscience was used to justify certain policies, from colonializing certain people to um, things such as Jim Crow here in America. Now, as I mentioned, that white in America has never been static. And it's a social construct. So if there's construction, if you're thinking of a house, you construct a house and then you can knock down some walls and add on to the house. So, for instance, as a very clear example, Irish people were not considered to be white people in the founding of this country. Again, Irish people, and we can say from 1671, from the time of the Oxford Dictionary, Bacon's Rebellion, and then we end up going forward into the 1700s up into the 1800s. Irish people were not considered to be white people. And there's a good book that you can order to read more about this as a resource. It's even online now in a PDF file. It was written by this individual who's, I believe, he was a professor at Harvard at the time. But it's called How the Irish Became White. How the Irish Became White. So within this context, what it means to be white in America has not only been a construction that has expanded in some ways and contracted in others, but it also leads us to the conclusion that religion has always been racialized in America. So we know that um, the so-called founding fathers of this country, such as Thomas Jefferson, for instance, in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, mentioned this issue about all people are free to worship. They should be free to worship God as they please, even so-called Mohammedans, which this is what the British used to refer to Muslims at the time as Mohammedans. And it was similar language in the Declaration of Independence, right? That we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then we have the Declaration, the U.S. Constitution in the First Amendment, and the first portion of the First Amendment talks about freedom of religion. So on paper, freedom of religion, according to the Constitution, has been what we could say sacrosanct to a degree, but how it's been applied socio-politically, religion has always been racialized in America. And this is important for us to understand in terms of what people call Islamophobia, that what much of Islamophobia is about is not about the misunderstanding of Islam, but it's actually the racialization of Islam and Muslims being seen as a group outside of the social construction of whiteness. So here's a good example, and there's many resources that talk about this. Again, there's documentaries online, there's been books that have been written about this. But again, Irish Catholics and the Irish people were predominantly Catholics, but Irish Catholics at one time were considered non-white. So we have right here one of a number of ads that existed, and not simply in southern states, by the way. We're also talking about in the North. These aren't just southern states. You know, Malcolm X famously said back in 1964, and actually he was giving this speech, he gave that speech at Wayne State University, but he said, if you're anywhere south of the Canadian border, you're in the South, right? So this overt non-white discrimination took place in northern states and very publicly. And at this time, Irish people were not considered to be white folks. So we have the issue here of, we'll read it, help wanted. A German Protestant, notice it mentions himself not just as a German, but a Protestant, or a colored girl, this means someone black, for general household work in a small family. So they're looking for a maid. Good reference required. No Irish need apply. And then it gives the address. So number one, the person who's looking for help wanted is German, but they showed themselves as German Protestant. Like, and this is where that acronym comes from, WASP, like white or Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So we have a German Protestant who was saying they're looking for a German Protestant or a colored, but they say no Irish need apply. No Irish need apply. Good references required. No Irish need apply. Similarly, there used to be signs in certain states in America, even in places in the Midwest later on, such as in Indiana, for instance. No dogs, Negroes in Irish are welcome, or no Irish welcome. This is something that's a very American phenomenon. Look at the date. This is 1865. and in Brooklyn Eagle in Brooklyn, New York. Now, in just addition, before we move on to the outer part, that even on in immigration, when people would come to the United States of America or come to somewhere like Ellis Island, so there's a great migration of Irish people from America to America during the time of the Great Potato Blight. When there was a famine that struck across Ireland, and people were getting away trying to seek some sort of work and some sort of food. So they came on boats packed. Many of them didn't make it, trying to get to the so-called promised land of the United States of America. And in immigration files or records, they would have on the check-in, they had white, and then they has another box just for Irish, right? And so we could say that Irish weren't considered um, fully white, even socio-politically, until we get into the earlier part of the 20th century. And even John F. Kennedy, America's first Catholic president, um, he even faced some conspiracy theories about him at that time, that he was an Irish Catholic, and if he got elected, that the Pope would be controlling the United States of America remotely. So these are very old. These are very old tropes. But now Irish people now have their white card, and you can have Irish people who are Catholics like Sean Hannity or even Bill O'Reilly, and they're white. No one questions their whiteness, and in fact, they can be overtly racist against other people who don't fit into whiteness. Now we have the issue of Arabs and aspirational whiteness. There's a good book written about this as well. I know both of these authors, Amani Jamal and Nadine Naber. Both of them Palestinians. They wrote a good book that highlights a lot of this race and Arab Americans before and after 9/11. So this is another good resource for you to take a look at for additional reading. Now, Arab immigration and entry through whiteness. So we first look at Greater Syria. When I use the word Syria in this is Syria meaning Bilad al-Sham, or Syria Kubra, meaning Greater Syria. So Syria at this time, this is during the time of the Ottoman Empire, was still in existence, or we would call it Dawud Uthmaniya. And Syria comprised of the following lands at that time. We have the modern nation state of Syria, the modern nation state of Lebanon, the Palestine, and we also have Jordan. All of this would comprise of what was called Greater Syria, or what we've known historically in Islamic history as Bilad al-Sham. So Syrian immigrants began to come to America in the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And one of those places in here is in Michigan. Like I know some people whose family migrated to the United States of America in 1898, for instance. I know a few people that came from Greater Syria, which we now know as what make up the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. People came as early as that time period to the United States of America. And then in regards to immigration standards in the United States of America, there is a case that took place where a Christian Syrian, George Najur, was granted nationalization in the state of Georgia in the year 1909, and a judge ruled that he, being from Syria, was from the Caucasian race. And we know there were quotas at that time of how many people the United States would let in from whites, from people who were not whites. So he was able to get nationalizations based upon the status of his whiteness. However, after this, there's something that took place that our country entered into or was part of World War One, and the Turks were under or what was been dubbed the Axis powers, along with the Germans and the Japanese, and then the Allied powers America was a part of. Of course, we know that the Ottoman Empire fell, Turkey lost, and then there were a few immigration acts that were put in. One of those being in 1917. Then we had another immigration act, which is also known as infamously known as the Asian Exclusion Act. It's been redubbed as that. But there was another court case in which a Syrian petitioner was denied, in which Arabs, or people who lived underneath the Ottoman Empire, including Greater Syria, were dubbed as Asiatics or Asiatic, right? So when we talk about Donald Trump and what's been dubbed as a Muslim travel ban, or the ban of people coming from certain countries to be able to get green cards or to file for citizenship, well, this didn't start with Donald Trump. This started about 100 years before Donald Trump, and there was blocking of Muslim immigration back then. And even when we read this historically, there were pejorative things that were said about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in regards to otherizing Arabs. And even Christian Arabs were otherized in the process. And this is why a number of Arabs who were Christian made the strategic step to try to separate themselves, Arab Christians from Arab Muslims. And we really saw this after 9/11 with Arab Americans in this area, as well as Chaldean Americans, where you began to see Arab American Christians moving out of Dearborn into other areas to be separated from Arabs in Dearborn, Livonia, and other places, going to Sterling Heights. And then you see where the Chaldean guys wearing the biggest chain, the biggest crucifix possible, so that people can distinguish him as a Christian. I remember when more Arab American Christians used to live in Dearborn. And there's a good article that I'm quoting in the Associated Press about this, about post 9/11 Arab American Christian flight, moving away from areas where there's Muslims so that they would not be confused with Muslims. There's even one case in which Arab Americans who were Christian argued for their white status, not to be labeled Asiatic. They argued, check this out, they argued that they are from the Holy Land. And this is the land in which Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, was born in and lived in. So they made the argument is, if you say that we're not white, then you're saying Jesus isn't white. So they even tried to use this logic and reasoning in American court, a decision, and this is documented, and you can look that up. Now, in the year 1943, Arabs and North Africans were deemed to be white by the federal government on paper. And then, of course, in 1965, we then have the Immigration Act of 1965, and this opened up the door even to more immigration of not just South Asians, but also Arabs to begin to migrate to these United States of America in larger numbers. Now, when saying this, we're talking about Arab Americans and North Africans. And by North Africans, we mean also people who are from the Amazighi, who are Amazighi, or what some people mislabel as Berbers, because people in that area don't call themselves Berbers. They've been labeled Berbers, like barbarian Berbers. So Amazighi people. And then you also have Nubian people as well, because Egypt was considered part of that. And we know in the southern part of Egypt, there are also Nubians. Everyone in Egypt is not considered to be ethnically Arab, which is a very interesting case you can look up that took place. This is a post 9/11 case where there is a Egyptian man from the southern area of Egypt, I think from Aswan. He filed a legal challenge so that he would not be classified as white. This man who filed this challenge is actually darker than I am, but because he came from Egypt, he was classified on paper as being white, though he clearly, and this goes to show you how ludicrous the construction of whiteness is in America, where you have people from Sudan and people from Egypt who are darker than I am, who are classified as white because of these this social construction. It's quite interesting. So on the one hand, Arabs and North Africans being seen as white on paper for immigration purposes, but socially and politically not enjoying the benefits of whiteness, meaning the privilege, the certain privileges that white people have moving around in the United States of America. And when we say this term, this has nothing to do with money or has nothing to do with economic status, right? That there's a level of social fluidity that white people don't have to worry about as much as Black folks. Like, for instance, someone could be white on paper from Egypt or Sudan, and they're driving through somewhere like Warren or Grosse Pointe, and they get pulled for driving while Black, even though their status and when they came to the country, they were classified as being white. But that means nothing socially about driving while Black or being followed in a store or being called the N-word and all of the rest that goes along with it, right? And we'll wrap this up so we can have some Q&A in a few moments. So we have this issue, and we're talking about Arab Americans, but there's been others. There's aspirational whiteness or proximity towards whiteness has been seen by many immigrants, and we're not speaking of refugees per se, but people who willingly come to America, that whiteness or proximity to whiteness is the quote unquote American dream, right? So normally what the American dream is that you have, and this may be old language, but I'll use it anyway, you'll catch my drift, that you have a white house with a white picket fence, and normally that white house and white picket fence is next to neighbors who are white, right? That's the White House and the white picket fence. And our president has been using this type of old trope and old language when he's talking to white women saying, you know, I'm keeping your suburbs safe, you know, because implied in that is that people who fall outside the social construct of whiteness are moving and living in the suburbs. So he's, you know, employing something that's very old and I would say very American in that type of language. It's nothing new what he's invoking. So what is this aspirational whiteness? And we see this clearly with Arab Americans, in particular, those who come from the area of Greater Syria, who have a lighter skin historically. And this has been written about, and I'm not trying to pick on people from Lebanon or Syria. I'm just stating this as what Arab Americans themselves have written about, and others who are sociologists, when they talk about this issue of the de facto racial hierarchy that exists in the United States of America. So aspirational whiteness or seeking proximity will cause people in certain groups to do certain things. Is one, distancing from that which would make one's family or group appear to be too quote unquote ethnic. And we see ethnic studies, it means non-white. Too ethnic means, or ethnic means non-white. So this shows itself off in different ways. I've had people where I heard they say they didn't want to teach their children Arabic or teach their children another language because they were scared that if they spoke this language at home with their children, that then their children wouldn't perhaps not master the English language or perhaps speak English with an accent. They want them to speak English with an American accent, thus separating themselves or distancing themselves from part of their culture, or certain cultural attire, like so-called dressing American. Well, America has no homogenous culture, right? So it's dressing American is really dressing according to the forms and to the style that has been historically set by the dominant culture, right? Another is distancing from proximity of living or associating around Black people, right? Given that Blackness is seen as a socio-political, and that should be antithesis, not the antithesis, but Blackness is seen as the social political antithesis of whiteness. So the opposite of whiteness is Blackness, right? So don't be seen associating around African Americans in particular. You don't want to live around African Americans. If you live around them for a little bit of time, even if it's in a suburban area, such as Southfield, the goal is to move away because you don't want to seem to be too close in proximity to Blackness, because either consciously or unconsciously, this is a barrier towards reaching the American dream. And this plays itself out in many ways. Even I've had friends who've migrated from other countries that had told me, and one of my friends who's even from Sudan, and Sudan means Bilal Sud, it means the land of the blacks, was told not to associate with Black people, because if you associate with Black people in America, then that will hold you back. Okay? Then we also have predominantly unconsciously is those who have proximity to whiteness or aspirational whiteness. They knowingly or unknowingly benefit from systemic anti-Blackness or systemic racism. That is the number one group of people who have been subjected to this in America are African American people, and then behind African American people, then we would say the native people of this land. So, for instance, under the construct of capitalism, going into a neighborhood where there's food deserts, where there's not proper grocery stores, and open up a corner store or a gas station, and then to be able to sell goods at slightly higher prices than in the suburbs, and to sell other products, under the system of capitalism, there's no problem with that, right? Now, that's an ethical issue regarding us as Muslims, but to benefit off of that and to be able to go into a community where you don't live in, that you actually want to stay away from, except to go and make money, to have transactional relationships, and then not to invest any money in that community. You don't live in that community, and then take that money outside the community to build up your own personal wealth, or for your ethnic community outside of the Black community, then that poses an ethical dilemma for us, at least as Muslims. That's highly problematic. Where people can go into certain neighborhoods and open up certain businesses and run certain things with more ease than the people who live in those neighborhoods themselves, where the people in those neighborhoods themselves can't even get small business loans, but other people come in and then they open up stores and et cetera, et cetera. So this is a problem. And this is why I don't like using this language POC, or people of color, because that term has been used or deployed to suggest some sort of Allahumma salli wa sallam wa barak ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ali. It is used to imply some sort of parity between those who aren't white with those who are Black, where in fact we have racial hierarchies, and there are other people who have immigrated to this country and are used as what we would call wedge races, or a wedge race that's used as intermediaries on behalf of the dominant culture and those people who hold power, to then use and exploit those people at the bottom. And the British were really good at doing this especially in certain areas of the Caribbean, and bringing in people from the Indian subcontinent as middlemen with the indigenous population, South Africa as well. Now, so with that, I will conclude with that, but I think that this is information that we can benefit from today in regards to how we understand moving around in this country, social, politically, as we face issues of systemic racism and political problems that we have here right now, and how this construct of whiteness has been weaponized. And for us as Muslims, we don't believe in multiple races. We believe that there's one race, there is a human race. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Right? We are all from the human race. We have different ethnic groups, and God gave us different skin colors and languages, but none of these have virtue over the other, as Allah mentions in the Quran, and as well as off the tongue of our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa alihi wasallam. With that, I will conclude. Are there any questions that we can bring up on the screen before concluding with this evening's class? Are there any questions in regards to the social construct of race? Oh, excuse me, the social construction of whiteness, excuse me. We'll take about another 30 seconds. If there's no questions, then we will conclude with this. And also next week's class, so we have daylight saving time coming up this weekend. So we'll be falling back, which means that next week's class and the preceding classes for our series will begin at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So next week's class will begin at 7 p.m., not at 7:30 p.m. Okay, there are no questions or comments. May Almighty God, may Allah bless you. May He bless your families. May He grant you a night of Jum'ah filled with illumination, filled with light, filled with happiness. And may Allah Azza wa Jal have mercy upon us, mercy upon the Ummah, mercy upon our country. And please remember to go out and vote on Tuesday. If you have absentee ballots, fill those out and drop them off at your drop boxes. Do not put your absentee ballots in the mail. Do not put your absentee ballots in the mail if you have not mailed them now. Fill it out and put it in the drop box that's at the designated locations, such as at your city hall area or approved precincts, not just random boxes that have been put in certain places, because we know one particular party in certain states has put up random boxes in certain areas that aren't approved. So fill out your ballot, put it in the mail by Monday, or if not, then vote on Tuesday. And if any of you see any irregularities or see any voter intimidation at the poll, then please contact CAIR Michigan immediately on election day. And with that, we will conclude. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal 'asri innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa 'amilus salihati wa tawassaw bil haqq wa tawassaw bis sabr.